Author's note: this story opens on St. Helena Island in July 1863. It is fiction, but the battle and prison experiences of Lieutenant Timothy Bradford are based on those of Captain V.B. Chamberlain of the 7th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. The 7th Connecticut was part of an expeditionary force which was sent to South Carolina in October 1861 to occupy the islands along the coast and establish a base for military operations against the city of Charleston. Union troops occupied the town of Beaufort on Port Royal Island and made their headquarters and their main base of supplies on the island of Hilton Head. The first charge on Fort Wagner, called Battery Wagner by the Confederates, is described in this book. Wagner was probably the strongest earthwork in the history of modern warfare. A second charge on Wagner was mounted just 1 week after the first. This second attack was repulsed. Wagner was finally reduced by siege and occupied by Union troops in September 1863. North by Night, 11, Chapter 1, a big Negro was cleaning fish at the end of a spindly pier. He looked up as the 2 Yankee soldiers came toward him. He watched steadily as they approached, but he showed no fear. The hot air shimmered as it rose from the sandy soil and the marsh grass whispered in a light breeze. The midday sun flashed on the water, making the white men draw their eyes into thin horizontal slits. The taller soldier raised his hand in a casual greeting and stopped before his boots touched the gray, weathered boards of the pier. "Good catch?" he asked. The Negro stood up slowly and hunched his massive shoulders and looked down at a half-cleaned fish. "Good enough," he said. Then he raised his head. "I hear talk that most of you are leaving soon." The shorter soldier pulled at his red beard. "Soldiers are always on the move," he said. "Why must you sail away from here? You buy our vegetables and fish, you rent our boats. It's good to have you here." The taller soldier smiled. "We have to fight." The fisherman lowered his head again. "If you must, 12, fight, you need a swim before you go." He pointed down the creek. "Take my boat and row across the inlet to the beach." The taller soldier reached into the pocket of his blouse, but the big man put up his hand. "No money today. Just take the boat." The soldier stepped onto the pier, as if to shake the colored man's hand. "Thank you," he said. "My name is Lieutenant Bradford and this is my friend Lieutenant Kelly." The fisherman didn't take the hand, but his mouth formed the hint of a smile. "Thank you," he said. "My name is Sam." Red Kelly took the oars of the little boat and Tim Bradford sat on the sagging seat in the stern as they moved along the creek and into the inlet that separated St. Helena from the complex of smaller outer islands. These islands laced the coast of South Carolina from Georgetown to Hilton Head. The Atlantic Ocean washed their beaches, and their backs were honeycombed with deep creeks and rivers where shallow-draft Confederate blockade runners had once found it easy to move and hide. Shortly after the start of the war, the first expedition to these islands had been mapped by President Lincoln and his military planners. There had been good reasons for taking the war to South Carolina without delay. The state had been the first to secede, the first to fire on the flag, and there was need of a base of supplies for the ships of the North. Now federal forces held most of the outer islands from Savannah to Charleston. A base of supplies had been set up on Hilton Head, and the town of Beaufort on Port Royal Island was occupied by Yankee troops. 60 miles northeast was the proud port of Charleston, 13, heavily fortified, Fort Sumter at the mouth of its beautiful harbor, the place where the war had begun. Fast Confederate packets still ran into Charleston under cover of night, taking supplies to the Southern forces, but the Federal Navy had made it a dangerous game. Nowadays most of the packets headed for Cape Fear, about 130 miles northeast of Charleston. As Tim's thoughts went back over the past 2 years, he was troubled by a familiar restlessness. He looked into the fish-smelling bottom of the little boat and across the inlet to the palmettos and scrub oaks that lined the shore of the outer island. And he flexed his hands. Red Kelly, watching him with piercing blue eyes, read his thoughts. "We move tomorrow," he said. "Be patient. God made this land and the sky above it. Live at peace this lazy day. Do you think we can win this war? We have many more men under arms than the Rebs and we're backed by the might of our industry. But this is a big, Far-ranging war. The good Lord knows how long it will last. Tim pushed back his cap and ran his hand through his stiff sandy hair. The boys in the West are fighting a war that moves. We're fighting a sitting war. They've done their share of sitting in the West and in Virginia. Before this week is finished you'll have your chance to fight again and a chance to die. Tim smiled. I have no wish to die. Red's face was flushed as he pulled at the oars. They moved across the inlet and glided into a tidal pool. They beached the boat, dragging it into the marsh grass. They moved through the heavy undergrowth, shielded from the sun by tall mop-headed palmetto trees. As they left the shadow of the trees the sun flashed pain into their eyes. 14. The beach stretched away to the northeast, ending in a point of land where palmetto trees hung over the sand on great shelves, their roots stripped bare by stormy seas. The ocean was flat and vast, and on the horizon the masts of a sailing ship barely moved in a distant, ghostly mist. To the southwest a big steam frigate moved slowly into Port Royal Sound. When its ensign had disappeared behind the trees they stripped off their clothes and splashed into the water. Red had never learned to swim, so he stuck close to the shallow places. Tim swam into deeper water and paddled just out of his depth, letting the current take him along the shore. Suddenly Red shouted, "Sharks!" Tim saw two putty-colored fins sliding obliquely toward him. Terror struck at his chest and he wheeled and swam for shore. As he reached shallow water he leapt and dashed, the water dragging at his legs, pulling him back. At last his ankles broke free. Red was white as plaster in the sun. His arms crooked tensely. "Saints preserve us," he said, "that was a close one, indeed." Tim stood on the sand, his chest heaving, and scanned the water for signs of the sharks but the fins were gone. Red said, "They gave it up as soon as you started to splash toward shore." "Thank God for that." I swam as if my feet were made of lead. The men pulled on their pants and sat on the sand. Red was quiet for a while and then he said, "I'm thinking of Nancy and Tommy back in New Haven, waiting for me to finish with the war. Tommy would be a little boy now, not a baby anymore. I've never even seen his picture. I keep begging Nancy to send me a photograph of both of 15, them, but I suppose she doesn't have the money to have one made." He smiled. "You single men are a happy lot. No family worries. Devil may care, that's what you are." Tim smiled. Then his face grew serious. "I have a girl," he said. "We have an understanding, but I haven't spoken to her father yet." "A girl is it? Well, you're a fox, Timmy boy. I've lived and fought with you since we left the north and you've never so much as mentioned a girl." Red's face took on a faraway look. "Nancy and I were thinking of moving away from New Haven after the war. Tell me, how is life in a country town?" Tim squinted his eyes. The distant sailing ship had scarcely moved, but the mist had burned away. "The town is clean," he said. "The yards of the houses are neat, and the village green is really green. The Connecticut River flows wide and deep below the houses. My girl's name is Kate. She lives 3 miles downriver. Her eyes are blue and her hair is dark. She's full of life. Sometimes I worry that she'll bust loose and go to New York or Boston and marry some tall, dark handsome man. But she writes you still." "Sure she writes, and she sounds as loving-hearted as she ever did." "Then put away your fears of tall, dark city men." Red smiled. "Tell me more about the town. What do the men do for a living?" "My father is the only doctor in town." "I guess I told you that before. Then there's the owner of the general store and the parson and the blacksmith. Most of the other men are farmers. It's just like any country town." Tim reached for a handful of sand and let it trickle through his fingers. "My father worked so hard he never, 16, had time for me or the twins. That grieved him sorely, I'm afraid. That's the way with doctors." The two men finished dressing and turned away from the stretch of peaceful beach and the limitless ocean. They walked to the boat and dragged it through the slime. Red stepped in and sat in the stern. Tim took the oars. Not a breath of air was stirring the trees. One of Tim's oars smacked the water, and a white egret flapped suddenly into the air from a saffron-colored tidal pool, flickering white against the bluish Spanish moss that clung to the trees along the shore. 17, Chapter 2. The moon came up above the cooking fires and shimmered behind the heat that was still held by the sands of St. Helena Island. Mosquitoes rose from the swamps and pools and sluggish rivers to the west. The soldiers unstacked their rifles and cleaned them. They packed their gear and settled down by the cooking fires and boiled what might be their last hot meal for quite a while. Tim and Red shared a tent with Captain Coutts and Dawson, but tonight they sat at the table alone. Tim had set out a candle in a bright brass holder. A faint breeze stirred the tent flaps, and the light flickered on the tin cups and plates. Red's beard glinted in the yellow light. Most of the boys had already struck their tents, but Coutts liked to keep things set up until the very last so he could spread out maps and do his work. He was short and fierce and powerfully built. He would sit for hours before the company went into action, his blouse open and his head bent, studying the map. He would pull his beard and fuss and fidget and suddenly get to his feet with his, 18, bristling chin thrust forward. "And that's how it will go," he would say, and then smile frostily to himself. "If the Confederates will cooperate." Tonight Coutts was having supper with the colonel. Tim hadn't seen Dawson since early morning. Everyone knew the regiment was to sail at dawn, and the camp hummed with talk of the fighting that lay ahead. The boys knew they were moving against Charleston, and most of them were eager to go. The candle guttered as the two men finished their meal. Red cupped his hand around the flame and blew it out. In a nearby tent they heard a clatter of plates, and a shout went up. Tim leaned back so that he could see past the tent flap. A man was running wildly around a cooking fire, stripped to the waist. "It's Corporal Steele," Tim said. "Every company has a clown." Now Sergeant Fitch and some of the other boys joined the fun. They hooped and hollered and jigged. The firelight struck their bodies like a patchwork quilt. Tim smiled to himself. A voice was suddenly raised above the din. A blonde-haired man of middle height came into the light. With both fists clenched. "You men have work to do," he screamed. "Clean your rifles and assemble your gear. Tomorrow we move up the coast." Tim said, "Dawson's drunk as a lord." He stood up and stepped outside the tent, moving toward the fire. Dawson looked up, his chin trembling. "Lieutenant," he said in a shaking voice, "are these your men?" "Yes, Captain, they're my men," Tim said. "Their rifles are clean and they're ready to go. They were just letting off a little steam. Are you being insolent with me?" Tim looked down at the captain's sweat-streaked shirt. 19, he turned to Sergeant Fitch. "Sergeant," he said, controlling the anger in his voice, "you men look over your gear and report back to me." "Captain." He turned. "Can I help you to a cup of coffee?" Dawson put his hands on his hips and swayed a little, focusing his watery eyes on Tim. "Mind your manners, Lieutenant," he said and turned and walked unsteadily away. As soon as he'd gone, Red staggered out of the tent. He put his hands on his hips, swayed back and forth and crossed his eyes. "Were you bein' insolent? Why, me?" Tim grinned, reached out a long arm and pushed Red so hard that he staggered back and fell on the grass. It wasn't long before Sergeant Fitch came back with his boys. "Our rifles are clean and our gear is packed," he said. Tim stood up and kicked some sand into the fire. "Are your buttons nice and shiny so the Rebs can see them in the dark?" "Like diamonds, sir." Corporal Steele was hanging back, but Tim could see that he was smiling. "Why don't you boys sit down for a while?" Steele sat on an empty hardtack box and the others sprawled on the grass. Sergeant Fitch cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Kelly, I wonder would you sing us that Irish lullaby?" "Now what would a strapping man like you be wanting with a lullaby?" Red sang in his fine tenor voice. As other soldiers gathered around, Tim stood up and left the group. He walked back to the tent. A warm breeze blew in from the ocean. He reached for his poncho and, 20, spread it on the ground not far from the tent. He lay on his back with his hands behind his head. Red's voice came clear in the silence of the starlit night. Tim thought of Kate. The last time he'd written her, he'd known in his heart he was writing the thoughts of a boy who had left home 2 long years before. If only he and Kate could meet and talk for a while. He remembered the first time he'd danced with her, the light from the chandeliers striking the whirling figures in the white-painted room of the new town hall. As he drifted into sleep, Tim thought about the dresses. Pink and salmon and powder blue against the men's black suits. When reveille sounded, Tim woke up and rolled over. Red lay on the sand a few feet away, groaning as he opened his eyes in the pre-dawn light. "Last night when I curled up here," he said in a rasping whisper, "I thought you had a good idea, sleeping on the ground." Tim felt his poncho and his clothes. They were soaked with dew. Captain Couts was already up, sitting on a keg outside the tent, straining his eyes to take in every detail of the waking camp. Already thinking about the day that lay ahead. "We break camp now. The transport moves with the morning tide." He stood up. "I suppose we have to set off a charge of powder by Dawson's head to get him up." Dawson came out of the tent and stared, silent and hostile, at Couts's back. "Very funny, Captain," he said, putting his hand to his head. The 4 men ate their rations of salt pork and hardtack and bitter coffee. The companies formed in columns to march to the pier and board a ferry that would take them across to Hilton Head. 21. As they crossed Port Royal Sound, the sky in the east was touched by the light of dawn. A mist hung over the sea. The ferry coasted into the landing and the soldiers were silent, watching the shore or staring moodily at the deck, showing none of the spirit of the night before. The troops waited by the big, gray sheds, built when the islands had first been occupied. The men talked quietly, and some of them, realizing that there would be a wait, took off their cartridge boxes and canteens and stacked their rifles. The pier crossed a narrow strip of beach and jutted more than 100 yards into the water. A narrow-gauge railroad track ran out to the end of the pier where a T-shaped float broadened the docking space. 2 large transports waited at the end of the pier, smoke trailing away from their single funnels. Just ahead of them a smaller vessel was being unloaded by half a dozen stevedores. Beyond the pier were the masts and funnels of a score of other ships, the farthest ones dim in the morning mist. Tim went forward to speak to Couts. The captain turned. "The colonel says dispense with roll call. No one will want to desert us here." He motioned toward the waiting transports and gestured toward a column of men that waited on the pier. "We board the ship on the left," he said. "Company K will occupy the forward deck. We will occupy the stern." Tim made his way back along the wall of one of the sheds. He found Red no more cheerful than anyone else. Tim said, "At least we're heading north. I suppose there should be comfort in that." Dawson stood close by. "North or south, it's all the same to me," he said. "I want to see the last of these flea-ridden islands. I'd like to be defending Beaufort. That's the job for me. The boys in Beaufort sit on verandas and rock all day." 22. Red smiled. "A veranda in New Haven would look good to me." The branches of a spindly oak showed above the roof of the nearest shed. The place was colorless and barren in the early morning light. Now the columns of soldiers began to move. A couple of Navy men dashed past on their way to their ship, holding their little pie-shaped hats, their bell-bottom trousers flopping foolishly around their ankles. A soldier raised a little cheer and the whole column took it up. One of the sailors blushed and quickened his pace. Couts and Dawson were waiting at the end of the pier. They motioned the soldiers forward and directed them to climb the gangplank. As the men reached the deck, they passed a solemn old sailor with a full white beard. He watched them closely as one by one they stepped to the deck, nodding to each in a silent gesture of mournfulness. The transport moved through the anchored fleet and into the channel. She steamed east until she was well away from shore. When she was 2 miles out she swung northeast, and some of the soldiers sought shelter from the heat on the deck below or in the shadows of the boats. Tim leaned against the rail with Red, watching the distant shore. Close by, the air seemed clear and the sun reflected on the water. But the distance was shrouded in haze. Shortly after noon one of the lookouts gave a yell. A big, black-bearded gunner shouted to his men, and they struggled up from where they lounged with the soldiers on the deck. 2 30-pound cannon were mounted near the stern, one on either side. The gunner leaned on the starboard, 23, cannon and shielded his eyes, looking into the mist that veiled the horizon. Tim strained his eyes, then clutched Red's arm and pointed across the crowded deck. There she is. A small, gray packet ghosted through the mist, about 2 miles off their starboard bow. The transport swung to port and the soldiers were ordered to stand clear. The gun crew went to work. They sponged and rammed. The gunner grabbed a big pinch bar and crouched and moved the gun around its track. He adjusted the screw to suit his judgment. When the gun seemed ready, the gunner sighted again along the barrel and gave another wrench with the bar. Then he stepped aside and shouted, "Fire!" One of his gun crew jerked the lanyard, and the wooden deck trembled as the cannon thundered and recoiled, straining against the breaching tackle. The ball arched out of sight, and Tim imagined that he saw a fleck of white where it hit the water short of its mark. Before the gunner could fire a second shot, the packet had shown them her stern and was lost in the mist. Red squinted into the distance. She must have been a phantom surely. She could hardly expect to run into Charleston in the afternoon. It must be risky enough at night. She was probably due to arrive last night. She must have been delayed somehow. She's killing time until sundown. The gunner heard Tim and nodded his head. And now we'll be on the lookout for her. He smiled. But they're slippery devils, sure enough.